All right. Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the fourth meeting of 5G Into the Abyss, where I and some invited guests in the future will read pieces of writing, pieces of literature that have inspired me to navigate these moments through the abyss, moments where we have questions or see clearly the state of material that is all around us, and the fact that we are just actually catapulting on a rock through space, and we might as well find a way to make some meaning out of that. So I'm going to continue with my reading of Schopenhauer as Educator by Friedrich Nietzsche. It is from his Third Untimely Meditation, which is a series of 4 essays. This is the third, and it's translated and with notes that I read in the previous episode by Daniel Pellerin. So I pick up in section 2. As I try to describe what a momentous occasion it was for me to cast my first glance at Schopenhauer's writings, let me dwell a little on an idea that occurred to me when I was young, more frequently and urgently than any other. When I allowed my wishes to roam to my heart's content back then, I thought to myself that fate might unburden me of the frightful and laborious duty of educating myself if only I could, at the right time, find a philosopher who would be my educator, a true philosopher whom I could obey without hesitation, because I could trust him better than myself. Next, I asked myself what the principles might be according to which he would educate me. And I pondered what he might say about the 2 educational maxims that enjoy such a vogue in our times. One demands that an educator quickly identify the particular strengths of his pupils, and that he should then direct all their vital powers, all streams of inward energy, and all sunshine towards that end alone, so that a single virtue might be brought to full fruition and fecundity. The second maxim, on the other hand, wants the educator to employ all available powers to nurse various virtues and to bring them into a harmonious relationship with one another. So should someone who has a decided inclination to be a goldsmith therefore be compelled to study music? Should we side with Cellini's father, who kept forcing him to play the flute, which to the father was that dear little horn, and to the son that accursed whistle? Surely it would not be right where talents are so pronounced and clearly expressed, in which case the maxim of harmonious development may be applicable only to weaker natures, in whom a whole host of needs and inclinations may have made their nest, but where none mean much, whether taken individually or as a whole. Yet, where do we find such a harmonious wholeness, several voices sounding together in a single nature? Where do we admire harmony more than in precisely such men as Cellini, in whom everything, insight, desire, love, hatred, tend towards one center, one powerful root, and in whom a harmonious system. We have a guest. Hello, and welcome to our reading session. I'm just going to keep reading in the middle of the second part of Nietzsche's Schopenhauer as Educator. Welcome to my friend Stephen. Yet where do we find such a harmonious wholeness, several voices sounding together in a single nature? Where do we admire harmony more than in precisely such men as Cellini, in whom everything, insight, desire, love, hatred, tend towards one center, one powerful root, and in whom a harmonious system of motions, to and fro, up and down, is formed precisely through the coercive, overbearing power that rules from the living center? Might the 2 maxims turn out, then, not to be in contradiction after all? Perhaps it is only that the one urges man to have a center, while the other insists that he must have a periphery too. That educating philosopher of whom I was dreaming would not only discover the central power, but would also know how to prevent it from acting in a destructive manner on all the other powers. The purpose of his education, it seemed to me, would be to reshape the whole human being into a living, moving solar and planetary system, and to identify the law governing its higher mechanics. Meanwhile, I had to do without my philosopher, and I tried out this and that. I realized how miserable we moderns look beside the Greeks and Romans, even just with respect to how little seriousness and strictness there is in our conception of educational purposes. Yet for more, yearning for more, one can run from one end of Germany to the other without finding what one is looking for, especially in the universities. Much baser and simpler wishes remain unfulfilled here. Someone desiring, among Germans, to train himself seriously as a speaker, for example, or someone seeking a school for writers would not be able to find either masters or schools anywhere. It does not seem to have occurred to anyone here that speaking and writing are arts that cannot be acquired without the most careful instruction and the most arduous years of training. The presumptuous complacency of our contemporaries is nowhere more demonstrable and disgraceful than in the sometimes stingy, sometimes thoughtless, but always puny demands they make of educators and teachers. How little suffices, even among our nobler and better taught types, under the guise of private tutors. What a collection of cranks and outdated methods commonly goes by the name of gymnasium and meets with our approval. What little we all content ourselves with so far as the highest learning at the universities is concerned. What leaders, what institutions, when we set them beside the demanding task of educating a human being to be a human being. Even the widely admired manner in which German scholars go at their research shows, first of all, that they are concerned strictly with science rather than with anything humane. And second, that they are trained like a lost flock to sacrifice themselves and to recruit new generations for the same sacrifice. Such a way of dealing with science, unguided and unconstrained by any higher maxims of education, but only let off the leash on the principle, the more, the better, is bound to be as harmful to scholars as is to the economic doctrine of laissez-faire to the morality of entire peoples. Who still remembers that the education of a scholar, if his humanity is not to be abandoned and left to die of thirst, is a most delicate problem? The delicacy of which task is made visible to anyone in those many cases where an ill-considered and all too premature devotion to science has not raised its devotees, but bent them out of shape and homed them with a hump. But there is still more important testimonial for the absence of all higher education, more important and dangerous and more general. If it is immediately clear why no speaker or writer can now be educated among us, because there are simply no educators for him, and if it is equally evident why a scholar has to turn out crooked and cranky, because it is science, in other words, an inhuman abstraction that is supposed to educate him, then we need to ask at last where any of us, whether learned or not, noble or not, is supposed to find his ethical examples and celebrities, the visible incarnations of all creative morality in this age and among these contemporaries. What has become of that contemplation of ethical questions which has at all times animated the more nobly developed kind of human fellowship? There are no such celebrities. There is no such contemplation anymore, and we are in fact consuming what we have inherited by way of ethical capital, which was accumulated by our ancestors and which we are no longer able to increase, but only to squander. Such matters are either no longer discussed at all in our society, or else it is done with such naturalistic clumsiness and inexperience that it can only arouse disgust. Thus, we have arrived at a point where our schools and teachers simply ignore any ethical education, or else resign themselves to mere formalities. Virtue, then, is a word that means nothing to either teachers or students anymore, an old-fashioned word that makes one smile, and those who do not smile are even worse, for they must be hypocrites. The explanation for such feeble-heartedness and the low ebb of all ethical powers is difficult and complicated. But no one who takes into account how a triumphant Christianity has influenced the ethics of our world will be able to overlook the repercussions of Christianity's defeat, which is becoming ever more probable in our times. Christianity managed, by the loftiness of its ideals, so completely to outdo all ancient moral systems and the universal reign of the natural that men ended up becoming insensitive to and disgusted with the natural. But later, when better and higher things were still recognized, but no longer could be attained, there was no way to return to the simple goodness and virtue of the ancients, however much one might have wished it. In this to and fro between the Christian and the ancient mode, between a timorous or mendacious Christian morality on the one hand, and a dispirited and embarrassed antiquarianism on the other, modern man makes his poor, uneasy home. The inherited fear of everything natural, but then also the renewed appeal of the same, the longing for a foothold somewhere, and the impotence of his insights, the endless stumbling from the good to the better and back. All this robs the modern soul of peace and ties it in such knots that it is forever condemned to infertility and joylessness. Never was there a greater need for ethical educators, and never were they harder to find. In times when doctors are most needed, during major epidemics, they are also at the greatest risk. For where are those doctors of modern mankind who themselves stand so robustly and healthily on their feet that they are able to support others and lead them by the hand? A certain darkening and dulling has befallen even the best personalities of our age, a permanent vexation with the struggle between pretense and sincerity that is being fought out in their breasts, an unrestfulness and lack of confidence in themselves that leaves them altogether unable to show the way to others or to be their master discipliners. Thus, I was letting my wishes roam very freely indeed, when I imagined that I would find a true philosopher for an educator, one who could raise his pupil above the inadequacy of the times and who might once more teach him to be plain and sincere in his thinking and his living. That is to say, to be untimely, taking that word in its deepest meaning. For human beings have now become so many-sided and complicated that they must be insincere if they want to talk, to assert anything, and to act accordingly. Such was my plight, such were my needs and desires when I made the acquaintance of Schopenhauer. I am one of those readers of Schopenhauer's who, after reading the first page, knew for sure that they would have to read all others and listen to every word he had ever spoken. I trusted him immediately, and I still trust him as much today as I did 9 years ago. I understood him as if he had written for me alone, to put it in a way that is easily understood, if also immodest and foolish. This is why I have never found anything paradoxical in his work, though here and there a little error. For what are paradoxes other than claims that inspire no confidence, because the author himself made them without much self-assurance, desiring only to appear brilliant, to be seductive, and to make an impression in general. Schopenhauer never concerns himself with how he appears, because he writes for himself, and no one likes to be cheated, least of all a philosopher who has made it his law to deceive nobody, not even himself. That is, to shun even the agreeable, sociable kind of deception that nearly every conversation entails, which writers in their turn imitate almost without being aware of it, and even more the deliberate deception from the speaker's podium by the artifices of rhetoric. Far from it. Schopenhauer converses with himself, or if we absolutely must imagine a participant, let us picture a son whom his father wishes to instruct. With forthright, sturdy, good-natured talk, he speaks to someone who listens with love. Such writers are missing among us. A powerful sense of well-being envelops us at the first sound of his voice. It is as if we were entering into a mountain forest. We breathe more deeply and suddenly feel well again. We find that the air is uniformly bracing here, that there is a certain inimitable natural ease, such as men possess who are at home in themselves, as masters over very rich homes, indeed. Contrast those writers who are more surprised than anyone when they manage to come up with something clever, and whose delivery is on that account always anxious and unnatural. Nor are we reminded when we hear Schopenhauer speak of the scholar who is by nature stiff and narrow-chested and therefore comes across as clumsy, sheepish, or pretentious. On the contrary, Schopenhauer's rugged and somewhat bearish soul teaches us not to miss, indeed, to disdain the smooth and courtly graces of the better French writers. In him, one will not find a trace of that imitative, as if it were silver-plated pseudo-Gallicism on which German writers pride themselves so. Here and there, Schopenhauer reminds me a little bit of Goethe, but otherwise of nothing German, for he knows how to express profound things simply, moving things without rhetoric, and strictly scientific things without pedantry. From what German could he have learnt as much? He also keeps his distance from the quibbling, floppy, and, if I may say so, rather un-German manner of Lessing, which is no small accomplishment considering that Lessing is, in respect of prosaic expression, the most seductive writer among the Germans. Let me start with the very best that could be said of Schopenhauer's way of writing by referring to his statement that a philosopher must be very honest if he is to do without any poetical or rhetorical aids. That honesty counts for something, that it might even be a virtue, is one of those private opinions that are prohibited in an age of public opinion. Thus, it may not be to praise, but it is certainly to characterize Schopenhauer when I repeat that he is honest, even as a writer, which is true of so few other writers that one ought really to be suspicious of anyone who picks up a pen. I can think of only one other writer whom I would consider Schopenhauer's equal in sincerity, perhaps even his superior, and that is Montaigne. To think that such a man once wrote is truly to find greater joy in living on this earth. The effect of my acquaintance with the freest and most vigorous of human souls has been such that I can only repeat what he said of Plutarch. No sooner had I set my eyes upon him than I grew legs or wings. If it were my task to make myself at home on earth, I would choose Montaigne for my companion. Besides sincerity, Schopenhauer has a second trait in common with Montaigne, a truly cheering cheerfulness. Cheerful unto others, wise unto himself. For there are two very different kinds of cheerfulness. The first, that of a truth thinker, always cheers and invigorates us, whether he is speaking in earnest or in jest, whether expressing his human insight or his divine forbearance, without grouchy gestures, trembling hands, or moist eyes, but always firm and simple, with courage and vigor, perhaps with a touch of the knight's hardness, and always as someone victorious. For that is what cheers us most deeply and fervently, to see a God triumphant amongst all the monsters that he has overcome. The second kind of cheerfulness, which one may encounter among mediocre writers and short-range thinkers, is only good for leaving one nauseous from reading. Thus, my impression of David Strauss, for example. One can only be ashamed of having that kind of cheerful contemporary who will merely give these times and generations a bad name before posterity. Such cheermongers, in fact, see nothing of the suffering and the monsters that they pretend to be confronting, and their cheerfulness is distressing because it is fraudulent, because it wishes to mislead us into believing that a victory has been won here. For basically, there can be cheerfulness only where there is victory, and that goes for the works of all true thinkers as well as for all true works of art. Let the subject matter be as terrible and grave as the problem of existence happens to be. The work will oppress and torment us only when it is a pseudo-thinker or a pseudo-artist who has doused it with the odor of his inadequacy. Whereas there can be nothing more joyful, nothing better than to find oneself in proximity to one of those victorious ones, one who must love what is fullest of life because they have thought what is deepest, and who must turn towards what is beautiful because they are wise. Only they truly speak, without stuttering or empty chattering. Only they truly move and truly live, as opposed to the eerie masquerading that otherwise passes for life amongst human beings. That is why, among such men, we sense something genuinely human and natural for a change, and why we are eager to exclaim with Goethe, "How glorious and delicious is a truly living thing, how well adapted to its condition, how genuine, how existing." What I'm describing is only the first, as it were, physiological impression that Schopenhauer made on me, that almost magical emission of inner power from one natural creature to another, which follows upon the slightest initial contact. And when I analyze that impression with hindsight, I find that it is composed of three elements: his sincerity, his cheerfulness, and his constancy. He is sincere because he speaks and writes to and for himself, cheerful because his thinking has overcome the greatest difficulties, constant because he can be no other way. His strength rises like a flame when there is no wind at all, straight and effortlessly upward, without any wavering, trembling, or restlessness at all. He finds his way no matter what, without anyone noticing him even looking for it, as if some law of gravity were making him run. So firmly and nimbly, so necessarily. Anyone with a sense for what it means, among so many contemporary human troglodytes, to be a complete, harmonious creature that swings solidly upon its own hinges, full of energy and free of inhibitions, will understand my delight and my amazement when I found Schopenhauer. I could guess that he was the very educator and philosopher for whom I had been searching all these years. I only had his book, of course, and therein lay a great limitation. So I made a particular effort to see through the book and to imagine the man in flesh, whose great testament I had before me, and who would only make heirs of those who wished and were able to be more than mere readers, namely his sons and pupils. That's the end of section 2. I'm going to stop there. I'll pick up with section 3 tomorrow, and we will continue plodding through Nietzsche's Schopenhauer as Educator. Thanks for tuning in to this brief opening of my window, speaking off the balcony, the 5G into the abyss, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Thanks.